Hello everyone, and welcome to MBA 605 Auditing. In today's session, we're going to talk about internal control, control risks, and Section 404 audits. We'll be talking about the three primary objectives of effective internal control. We'll talk about the difference between management's responsibilities for maintaining internal control and those responsibilities of the auditor for understanding and evaluating those internal controls for financial reporting purposes. We'll talk about a framework that the auditor can use to understand and determine the effectiveness of these internal controls. And we'll talk about the documentation that comes out of the understanding and determination of effectiveness of these controls that auditors ultimately deliver. When we talk about internal controls, we speak to three broad objectives that management, that is management of the company, is tasked with in the design and effective internal control system implementation. And those are compliance with laws and regulations, reliability of financial reporting, and efficiency and effectiveness of operations. From a financial statement audit perspective, the auditor is primarily concerned with the reliability of financial reporting. The impact of effective internal controls over financial statements that are prepared as part of the year-end process for a company are what are most important to auditors. So we speak to this difference between management and our financial statement auditors. According to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, it is management's responsibility for designing internal controls, designing effective internal controls, as well as implementing those internal controls, and then staying abreast of whether those controls are implemented sufficiently and whether the controls are achieving their intended purpose. So we note that management's design and implementation of internal controls is based on two key underlying concepts, and those are reasonable assurance and inherent limitations. With respect to reasonable assurance, we're referring to the difference between reasonable assurance and absolute assurance. Absolute assurance is a standard that is generally held to be too high, and the cost-benefit trade-off of getting to absolute assurance is generally determined not to be acceptable. And so that's why we're willing to accept reasonable assurance versus absolute assurance. The issue of inherent limitations refers to the fact that we have people implementing and executing these controls, and with people come mistakes and misjudgments. And so there's some level of inherent limitation to the effectiveness of a control simply by the fact that we have people involved in the process. So when we talk about management of public companies that are subject to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and specifically Section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, their management is required to issue an internal control report that includes the following, and that is management's acknowledgement of their responsibility for internal controls. That is to say, it's not the auditor's responsibility to design or execute internal controls. It is management's responsibility. And management must also assess the effectiveness of those controls and ensure that the controls evolve as the organization evolves. Management assessment of internal controls includes the evaluation of the design of the internal controls over financial reporting. That is, are the controls designed in a way that they would catch errors on a timely basis and allow for their correction? Or is there a flaw in the design that even if the control were operating effectively, it wouldn't address the internal control risk that exists? And then we say that management must also test the operating effectiveness of those controls. So that is, have they been implemented, and are they being followed, and then are they achieving the intended purpose? The auditor's responsibility, though, is different from that of management's responsibility. The auditor is not responsible for designing the internal controls. The auditor is not responsible for ensuring that the internal controls have been implemented and are being executed as intended. The auditor is looking at those controls, looking at the organization, looking at the results of the financial reporting for the organization, and determining whether the control risk is adequate to ensure the accuracy and reliability of the financial reporting. And so there we're saying that the auditor is mostly concerned over reliability of financial reporting and classes of transactions. To get to this point, the auditor must understand the internal controls of the company, and they must also test those controls. And the tests would include tests of significant account balances, significant classes of transactions, disclosures, and related financial statement assertions. This framework, and in order to perform our test, in order to come to some conclusion on the internal control environment within a company and its effect on the financial reporting for the company, we need a framework. And this framework that we see in front of us here, that consists of the control environment, which includes then risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring, is the Committee of Sponsoring Organization Control Environment. And it provides us with just a framework, a way of thinking about, and a way of approaching an assessment of an internal control structure in a company. So when we talk about the control environment, we're really talking about the overall environment that a company operates in. So is that environment one that's characterized by high integrity and ethical values? We look for a commitment to competence. We look for a board of directors or audit committee participation in that company. So what we're looking for is a level of engagement that shows management understands that it's their responsibility to establish controls. It's their responsibility to be committed to the execution of those controls, and that the board of directors and that the audit committee are aware of this and are engaged in the management of the company such that the controls are effective. So this overall control environment we think of as being an umbrella under which other control mechanisms are executed. And those other control mechanisms include things like management's philosophy and operating style, and that's evidenced through human resource policies and practices and the organizational structure of the company. And so one of these other activities is the idea of risk assessment. And with risk assessment, what we're looking for is management's ability and practice of identifying issues that increase the company's risk, estimating the significance of those risks, assessing the likelihood of whether the risk is really going to occur or not, and then determining actions necessary to manage the risk. And so what we're saying here is that management is just not oblivious to the environment in which they operate, and that a sound internal control structure would suggest that they assess those risks and address them in their operations. Another area that we see in the control environment are control activities. And these control activities are the policies and the procedures that are put into place to assure that a strong internal control structure exists. And when we talk about control activities, we're looking at this adequate separation of duties. So the same person who has physical custody of an asset isn't determining the accounting or doesn't have access to determine the accounting treatment of that asset. We're looking for proper authorization of transactions and activities so that there is some oversight evident in the company. We're looking at adequate documentation and record keeping. We're looking at literally physical control over assets and records. So if we have a cash fund at the organization, who maintains physical control over that cash fund? What's done to ensure the safety of that cash fund, such as keeping it in a locked safe versus in someone's unlocked desk drawer? And then we also go back to the separation of duties. So the person who maintains that cash isn't the one who records the entry coming as a result of the transactions coming from that cash fund. And then we look on independent checks on performance. And here what we're looking for is the idea of internal audit, going back in and looking to make sure that all of the items, the activities, the policies and procedures that we just talked about, the policies are adequate and that the procedures are being followed. When we talk about this adequate separation of duties, we're really talking about the examples of we have custody of assets separate from the accounting of or for those assets. We have authorization of transactions separate from the person who maintains custody of those assets. So we can see that what we're trying to do is separate this authorization and ownership or custody elements. When we talk about proper authorization of transactions and activities, we talk general authorization or specific authorization. When we talk about adequate documents and records, we're looking at examples of that would include pre-numbered consecutively, such as checks. Checks are pre-numbered and they're sequentially numbered. We're looking at items that are prepared at the time of transactions and not prepared in advance. They may be designed for multiple use, and they may be constructed such to help facilitate the correct preparation in accordance with our control procedures. And then finally, we talk about physical control over assets, and that's that the most important type of protective measurement from safeguarding of assets and records is the use of physical precautions, and that is so they are locked up when they should be locked up with access to that safe place only by authorized individuals. Then we get to the independent checks on performance, and that's where we talk about the need for audits and a constant review of whether the control is still designed correctly given the change in the organization and the growth in the organization, and then is it still being implemented and executed as intended, and that is that it didn't get implemented right away as a result of its novelty, and then just gradually and slowly over time it stopped being done. Information and communication is another one of the items that fall under this umbrella of a control environment. And with information and communication, obviously we're talking about the accounting information system. And we want to ensure that the accounting information system is capturing the transaction, and it's capturing all of the transaction, and that the transaction is being processed through the system in a way that the output of all of that processing ensures conformity with our generally accepted accounting principles or whatever other standards might be being applied to that audit material. And in the case of financial statements, it's obviously that the financial statements are reliable and accurate form of output. Monitoring, again, deals with the management's ongoing and periodic assessment of the quality of internal control performance. And the goal of that is to determine whether the controls are operating as intended and modified when needed. And so, again, we point to this is management's responsibility to monitor the controls that they designed and that they put into place to make sure that they're still working as they were intended to work, and that they are still resulting in the output of reliable and accurate financial statements. The auditor now, as we said, is tasked with understanding the internal controls and then assessing the control risk as a result of that. And we go through a multiple phase approach to doing that. And so one is to obtain and document understanding of internal control design and operation. So what are the control mechanisms that are in place, and how do they work, and what are they aimed at providing quality assurance around? Once we've done that, we assess the control risk. So we design, perform, and evaluate tests of these controls. So are they really working as a part of phase 3 talks about, are they really working as a part of our audit? And then phase 4 goes on to say, well, after we've done all of that, how does our evaluation of that internal control structure impact the design of the audit program through the detection risk and substantive test development? So the part of understanding the internal control says that the auditing standards require auditors to obtain an understanding of internal control for every audit. That procedure to obtain that understanding is through inspection, through inquiry of personnel, and through observation of personnel. We get to that level of understanding using different methodologies, such as a narrative. So we talk with somebody, we sit down, and essentially we're interviewing them, and then after we interview them, we write out a narrative of what that interview exposed. And in a lot of cases, the auditor would then give that narrative back to the person they interviewed and ask them to read the narrative and make any comments as to its accuracy. We also use flow charting tools, and that's to graphically illustrate for readers what the flow of a document or the flow of a process is, and where in that flow or process, where are the key internal controls. And then we use instruments like an internal control questionnaire that we give to the client, request that they complete, and then we receive those back. We evaluate those, and then we may do some sort of testing or review of what those responses are in order to assure that they are actually legitimate responses. And obviously, we don't use just one of these methods. It's a combination generally of these three methods and perhaps other methods as an audit firm may dictate as necessary. When we talk about the narrative, we're talking about the issues that might be included would be, well, what is the origin of every document and record in the system? What is the original source that initiates that document? What is the processing that takes place of that document? What happens to every document and record in the system as it's processing? And this provides us with an indication of the controls relevant to the assessment of internal control risks. And like I say, what we're doing then as we're gathering all of this information is putting it into some narrative that becomes a part of the audit file for our use later or another auditor's use in another section or at another point in time. We also talk about this evaluating the internal control operation. And so when we're evaluating the internal control operation, what we're really doing is updating and evaluating the auditor's previous experience with the entity. We're making inquiries of client personnel to understand what may or may not have changed. We're examining documents and records to ensure that the internal controls that we exposed in our earlier work are actually being followed. We may observe entity activities and operations, and we may have the client perform walkthroughs of the accounting system or sit with us and walk us through the initiation, the processing of transactions, and then the output of those activities and the impact of all of that on the financial statement reporting. To assess internal controls, really what we're looking at as auditors are to assess whether the financial statements are auditable. That is, are the balances, are the controls sufficient that we feel the balances can be audited, or do we have a worse problem than that? We'll determine whether assessed control risks are supported by the understanding obtained, and then we may use a control risk matrix to assess control risk. This control risk matrix really just helps us to graphically and succinctly understand where are the risks in the organization's financial reporting processes at the transaction level that would then help us to more specifically tailor our audit program and the design and execution of that. Within the control risk, we identify the audit objectives. We identify the existing controls that impact those audit objectives, and we associate those controls with the audit objectives. And then we evaluate any control deficiencies, significant deficiencies, or material weaknesses that may come out of our review of that process. And when we talk about significant controls, we're really talking about the significance and the likelihood. And we can see that significance is graded on a scale of material to immaterial. Likelihood is graded on a scale of remote to reasonably possible. So that the higher it's possible, the higher likelihood that it is possible that a control may fail or that a weakness may exist, and the more material the amount of that weakness or control failure is, will help us to then tailor again our audit testing to ensure that has a control failed, and is there a misstatement or inaccuracy in the financial statements material enough? And here we talk about the idea of materiality, right? So is it material enough to cause the user of those financial statements to change their economic decision? When we talk about to identify deficiencies and material weaknesses, so we're identifying the existing controls again, we're identifying the absence of key controls, we look at the possibility of compensating controls. That is, well, this control isn't in place, but there are these other controls that are in place that get us overall to the intended purpose of this key control that isn't in place. So are they essentially mitigating controls? We decide based on that look whether this significant deficiency or material weakness exists, and then based on that we determine potential misstatements that could result in financial statement misstatements, and then move forward with the design of our audit program and the execution of that program appropriately. When we find that there are significant deficiencies or material weaknesses, the auditor is required to communicate this in writing to the audit committee. Where we have less material or significant, so we have immaterial weaknesses, we can communicate those to management via letters, and we might also include in those letters ideas for operational improvement. So the procedures to test effectiveness of controls in support of a reduced assessed control risk are called tests of controls. These tests include inquiry of client personnel, reperformance of client procedures, examination of documents, records, and reports, and the auditor will then observe control-related activities. And if you'll note, the important part about this is that these steps or these procedures for testing of internal controls or the control environment are very similar to the evidence that we talked about earlier with respect to what are the types of evidence that an auditor gathers to test the financial statements. And we talked about things like inquiry and reperformance, examination and observation at that point in time. So these are the exact same types of evidence that are being gathered. They're just being gathered around the internal control environment of the organization. Once we've completed all of those steps, we then have to, as auditors, report on the internal controls, and that do they provide reasonable assurance, that is reasonable and not absolute, that a material weakness in the internal controls are identified. And we're required, if you recall from our reporting session, we're required to write a separate report for publicly traded Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404 required companies. We're required to develop a separate report on the results of our audit of the internal controls around the financial reporting of a corporation. That report can take the form of either an unqualified or adverse or qualified or disclaimer. And so if we find no material weaknesses, no scope restrictions, we can issue an unqualified report. If we find that there are material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, we have to issue an adverse opinion. Or if we are limited, that is, the client won't allow us access constituting scope limitation, then we are required to issue either a qualified opinion identifying this scope limitation or a disclaimer opinion that says we can't issue an opinion on the adequacy of the internal control environment at the company. That is, we can't say it's adequate or inadequate, so we disclaim opinion.